Thank you very much. Just to keep it moving, first question. Can you tell us about your culture and that how that has shaped your identity?
Culture is the way I would explain culture is it's this really big thing. Like, it's bigger than all of us. But all of us put together creates culture, right? And when we look at it as individuals, culture is this really small part of who we are. Or it may be a big part. You won't know until you experience it. And the way you have to experience it is to go somewhere different. So for me, that was leaving Singapore and coming to Australia to study back in 2011. And you don't know how much culture is ingrained in you until you're exposed to something very different. Because that's where the word culture shock comes from. And then you'll feel like, oh, well, this is what culture looks like now. Because you're not assimilating to that new culture. And when you begin to test that, that's when that small part, culture becomes that small part, and it creates your identity. And it'll take time, it's not overnight, sometimes short amount of time, sometimes decades, but that'll slowly transform and evolve your identity. So in a very mixed way, that's what cultural identity, I think, means to me, in that culture is something that you have to experience and grow and learn and figure out who that is for you, and then it'll form a part of you as you continue to evolve and grow and change. Yeah.
I had written so many notes, but I think I'm just going to speak from the heart. So when I was first given this topic, I found that it was very hard to put a finger on exactly what culture means to me, or identity, or cultural identity. I sat down, and after our online briefing the other day, Kuda, I made some notes. I jotted down some ideas of what I think it is, and I think to sort of put it all together, for me, identity is like this bubble, like a circle, and within my identity is my culture, it's my social identity, my professional identity, and within all that, deep down inside, I'm driven by my values and my system of belief, which has been ingrained in me, a learned behavior or a learned pattern from the time I was born up to today. And when I look at culture itself, a big part of culture, I think, is my rich history, my heritage, where I've actually come from, my forefathers. And in that sense, I just want to go back to history a little bit. My grandmother actually moved from India, from a small village in Punjab in India, it's known as Bathinda, to Malaysia in 1956 with my grandfather and her then 1.5-year-old son, who's my dad. 50 years on, in 2003, I made the big move to Australia as an international student to pursue my higher education studies. And now my kids are born in this country. I think, to sum it all up, to know where you're heading, it's very important to know where you have come from. And I think when Mamta invited me to do this podcast, it just made me look back at my history, my forefathers, where I've actually come from. So I identify with India a lot in terms of my past and my history, and identify with Malaysia a lot in terms of my upbringing and the environment in which I was groomed to be the person that I am today. And last but not least, I came across a beautiful saying by a theorist, Stuart Hall. He said that identity is not a being, but becoming. It transcends. It's belonging to future as much as past. And that's how I'll conclude that today. Thank you.
All Well said, guys. We love answers from the heart, by the way.
Okay, so I'll tell you all a little bit about my culture as well as how that's really shaped me as a person today. So definitely, as James has said, you don't really know much about culture until you see another culture. And that other culture could be your parents' culture, maybe a different country that you've migrated to. It's just a different culture, right? So I've grown up in Perth, and I was pretty much for the first 7 years of my life, I've grown up here. In 2010 until 2013, my family and I moved to Afghanistan, and we lived there for 3 years. So Afghanistan is my ethnicity. I've always, before going there, I've always identified as, I'm Australian, I'm Aussie, but I have Afghan roots that are, my distant heritage. And at the age of 8, when we went to Afghanistan, that's where my cultural identity took a big turn. I attended mainstream Afghan school, and that being, I wasn't fluent in my own language anyway, which is Farsi, let alone being able to read or write. So I've somewhat experienced the migration journey of, going to a whole another country you've never been before, except I had a bit of familiarity because my parents were from there. So I was at school, and it's difficult to fit in as someone who doesn't read or write, who isn't familiar with the culture to a degree, and for safety reasons, I couldn't disclose that I'm a foreigner. So I had to try my best to act as if I'm an Afghan person, but I didn't know how to act because I couldn't, read, write, speak the language very fluently. So that made it very complex to fit in. And that's where my whole journey began, because I was exposed to a whole nother culture. I was forced in a way to fit in. And what happened was that the pieces of my identity started to unravel. I found some pieces. Oh, okay, wait a minute. I'm also Afghan, or I've got some Afghan in me. But it was more so, how am I going to fit those pieces into my new identity? How do I make the bigger picture? And really, it's still in the process. I'm still trying to shape my identity, but I found the pieces, which is the most important thing. And so far, that's how I'm shaped, how it's all shaped, yeah.
I probably should have written some notes down. I did get this ahead of time, but I hate being constrained, which is probably how I look at culture, actually. But constantly wrestling with the things that I'm born with and inherit and the things I want to create. So culture, if we think about it in the way that we talk about it just in everyday conversation, because I think people conflate culture and ethnicity rather than seeing it as a part of it. Ethnically, I have 2 Greek parents, one from the very far west of Greece, one from the very far east of Greece. So there's differences even amongst that. I'm also the youngest of 3 by a very long margin as well. So my siblings are 10 and 12 years older than me respectively. So their experience of their ethnicity in their time growing up in Australia is actually quite different from mine. But it took me getting older to see that. So I'm also baptised Greek Orthodox, and I'm not particularly religious. Sorry, Mum, but it's still very much a part of who I am. It's not actually something I can disentangle myself from. So I think all of these things start to tell some version of a story about me and certainly how I see myself. But the way I think about it is, my ethnic part of my culture really is about the things that I inherit and the things that come before me, and the culture that I identify with are the things I co-create with others. And for the time that I was growing up as a young man, I've always had a very multicultural group of friends, and the affinity I felt most strongly about, more than being Greek or being Greek Australian, was more like, my parents came from somewhere else too. And that was always the connective tissue between, at least, what I saw as a community or or a culture to belong to. I'm sure if you spoke to Greek people in Perth, they wouldn't have a clue who I am, because I'm not necessarily like a good Greek boy. They might know my dad. But that doesn't mean I'm not proud of where I'm from. It's more about, as I've grown older, I've started to try and, I have a genuine desire to understand that story of, you know, both sides of my family. My father is a post-World War II refugee. When the war stopped, his family were going to travel by boat to return back to his island, and then there was a fire disaster that ended up sinking in the middle of the Mediterranean. So he was actually a refugee in Palestine under the British Mandate and Egypt. So before he ended up coming back here too. And that actually has formed a part of my story in some ways as well. So there's so much that I've inherited, there's so much I'm trying to create, and there's so much I'm trying to make sense of that I think end up becoming my own experience of culture. I'll leave it there.